Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us and for your interest in Intellius. This is Steve Birmingham, Vice President of Sales and Marketing here at Intellius. Joining me today is Rob Flannery, Director of Services. Today, Rob will be presenting on Infor Process Automation and its many uses. So whether you're new to IPA or have been working with ProcessFlow for years, everyone can benefit from taking a look at the creative ways we have implemented this tool to simplify processes and resolve issues. This webinar is being recorded and available for anyone that wishes to view the replay. We will be sending an email to everyone with collateral and the replay link included. For those with questions, feel free to ask via the chat window on the WebEx console. Time permitting, we will attempt to answer all. If we do not get to your question, we will make certain to get back with you with an answer. So on the next slide, let's take a quick look at the agenda. Again, I'll be going over the brief introduction of Intellius and then handing it over to Rob, who will be going over the next three bullets as well as questions. But before I hand it over to Rob, I would first like to provide a little background on who we are. Who is Intellius? We are an Infor Alliance partner based out of Dallas, Texas, and have been in business since 1999. The next slide talks about the full array of consulting services we offer. So Intellius does offer these consulting services that bridge the gap between function and usability. This includes technical services, i.e. security, integrations, migrations, upgrading, including talent management and landmark, cloud services, as well as application consulting. Additionally, Intellius provides cost-effective software solutions that streamline and simplify Infor loss and enterprise resource planning applications. We have developed and implemented applications to assist organizations that run loss in HR, payroll, financials, procurement, and/or supply chain with our benefit add-ins, payroll automation, and speed data entry software solutions. So again, thank you everyone for joining us today. At this time, I will be handing it over to Rob.
Hi, thanks, Steve. Thanks again, everyone, for joining. Again, my name is Rob Flannery, and so we'll jump into the content now, talking a little bit about IPA overview, what the product is, a little bit about what it does, the different components, and then some of the more advanced uses and solutions that we've implemented using the tool before. So what is IPA? I like to explain it to customers who are implementing it as a workflow tool that implements technology that kind of looks like a flow chart that's actually doing the work as it's displayed. So this example on the slide is a very simple process flow. On the left, we have what would really be considered maybe a business process, a design that's written in Visio or developed in Visio. And then on the right-hand side here, we have the actual process flow that would be written and developed using the Infor Process Designer that shows what it would look like, comprised of a start and an end node. You can see that's very similar to the Visio process on the left. And then also within inside those, we have specific nodes, which are functions that perform specific tasks. So in this case, we have a query node, which would be querying and selecting records in a database that match a criteria. In this example, it might be employees with a start date in the past 31 days. For benefit enrollment eligibility, new hires. For each record found, we're looping through iteratively those records. And we're sending an email using the email node. Again, all of these different nodes perform various functions or specific functions and tasks within Infor Process Automation. So that email node would be telling them instructions for benefit enrollment, including a link back to the self-service application, so on and so forth. We can include attachments in the emails, PDFs, things like that, all automated, all run through the Infor Process Automation. So there's three major components to the Infor Process Automation solution. The first of which we're going to talk about is the Infor Process Designer. So that IPA term, again, when you hear IPA, it's kind of an umbrella term to refer to the application as a whole. All of these other components kind of make up what that IPA solution encompasses. So this Infor Process Designer, sometimes referred to as IPD, is this tool you see on the screen. It's a kind of a GUI development tool set, and it's a product you would download from Infor Extreme, and then it's used to connect into your Landmark or IPA server, similar to what you would do with LID or the Loss and Security Administrator, other tools you might be familiar with. These are supplemental desktop-based development tools that you're logging into and working with the application. A little bit about what that actually might look like. So hands-on, I have it open. Let me get back into here. So I have this installed onto my desktop, and I can open it up here, connect into the server, and this would be my development workbench. So I can create a new Infor process file. This is really like I'm developing my code, or I'm developing my flow here. Our palette is on the left. These are our different nodes that, again, perform those various functions. So in this example we just talked about, we want to query Infor loss and data. So we're going to drag and drop a query node, and then we're going to connect all of these different activity nodes to build our process flow, our data flow, or business process design, ultimately completing the full process and then building out properties for each of these nodes. So in our query string here, we would be saying select all records from employee where start date matches whatever criteria, and then our email content would be typing in or passing variables dynamically for who are we sending it to. Maybe it's coming from a no reply. Our subject, we can pass the employee ID, the name, etc. Build out HTML content, make that email a little nicer looking, more friendly for the employees to look at. Also include attachments and things like that. So this is going to be our Infor Process Designer where we're actually building the flows. The next component we're going to look at is the Process Server Administrator. So when we develop these flows in the designer, we ultimately deploy them or upload them onto the server, and then they're running like jobs on the system. So in the Process Server Administrator, we're using that to not just administer the flows that are running, reviewing the logs and things like that, but also setting up users. If we have people participating in approvals, we could be defining variables, global variables, connection strings, all different types of things. This particular tool, there are two options to access that. This is our sandbox environment. We have a web-based Process Server Administrator here, and we can log in and look at our users that are set up and the tasks that are assigned to them. We can also go into our administrator tool and review work units that may be processing. The work units are going to be, each time a process flow runs, it creates a work unit log. It's kind of like a job log or something you might, if you're familiar with S3, the job scheduler. That's would be what we're looking at here. We can see when a flow runs, its status, metrics on not just how long it took to run, but if there are approvals, who approved it, how long did it take. All this information is stored in the database, it's reportable, and then it's managed through this particular tool. We also have the Infor Rich client that can be used to access this administrator. This is going to be more of a thick client tool, kind of like the Infor Smart Office, power user-based tool that's installed on the desktop. Just another user interface and option for administering IPA. The third component is going to be the in-basket. This is going to be the end-user-facing component. The Infor Process Designer, the first tool we looked at, that is a developer tool. The process server administrator, that's something your IT group, maybe HRIS, systems analyst type users who are going to be supporting the system would be logging in there to set up users and check on logs and things like that. And then the in-basket is where our day-to-day users who participate in workflow approval are going to be interacting with ProcessFlow. So on my desktop, I have a portal session set up. The administrator, or excuse me, the in-basket can be accessed directly as a link, or it can be integrated into some other homepage or application. In this case, we have it set up as a bookmark in our Lawson portal. So if I were a requisition approver, I would come in here and I can click on my in-basket and look at all items that I have to take action on. This screen is configurable. We can change the way it looks, the links that are displayed, but the idea here is we're not just having access to our work, so I can see requisitions that may be processing in the system and requiring my approval, but then there's also, you know, different metrics and things like that where I can see a task breakdown of the work that I have assigned, how long it's been waiting. I can also see if I've sent a request potentially, who it's waiting on, how long it's been there, if I need to email them and force an approval through, rush it before the weekend, something like that. So anyone who does approvals, the in-basket's going to be where they, you know, they're kind of living as far as the IPA solution's concerned. All of these, you know, may be familiar to some of you. If you're already running IPA, obviously these should definitely be familiar, but maybe you're coming from PFI or you've heard of PFI, the ProcessFlow Integrator tool that was available in version 9 and before. Very much conceptually the same types of things. So you'd have the designer and the administrator tool and the in-basket in PFI. IPA is just the version 10 release of that, a little bit of a rebrand and a little bit revamped. So there's more functionality available, enhanced features in the designer, better metrics and reporting and analytics, all those things, themes you see that are common with Infor as they release these new versions of the software. So what are some common uses for IPA? These are just some basic, very common types of tasks that are used for IPA or solutions or categories. So for IPA, obviously email notifications. So we can send something that, like in the first example where we had talked about benefit enrollment, that would be more of a batched process. So find a group of users that meet a criteria and notify them to take action or of summary. So we can say things like new hires go enroll in benefits. We could also send something to managers saying, here's all your employees who are delinquent on a specific task, or even from an administrator perspective, here's a list of jobs that are in a waiting status or anything like that. Anytime you want to automate a sweep or a check of data, IPA can be used to interrogate that and send out notifications. And it can also be used to send kind of one-off notifications. So the Lawson application has a series of triggers built into it that are hooks, I guess, for IPA in a sense. So for example, something I was talking about with a customer is notifications on specific personnel actions. The PA52 screen has a trigger built into it that we can configure and turn on directly within the application at the HR company level to say every time an end user creates or releases or approves a PA52 transaction, initiate workflow. And then we can define that workflow to notify a set of users, make updates in the action or within the application and things like that, which leads us into our next step, the approvals. This is a very, very common use for IPA. Lawson has a set of common approvals that people use. Some examples of that would be on the requisitioning side. We can approve or automate approval of the RQ10s, invoices, journal entries, PA52 approvals from manager self-service perspective. Also within the landmark-based applications like talent management, all of your approval actions are handled through IPA there as well. And then we can also build custom approvals in to the application. Something that I've done in the past would be like vendors. Infor does not have any sort of vendor approval or pending vendor status, but we can use IPA and some other extensions like Design Studio to build in triggers directly into the application and then use IPA to automate the approval and processing of adding those new vendors into the database. Systems integration and interfaces. This is also a very popular use for IPA. One of the great things about it is obviously it's an Infor tool, so it has Infor APIs or integration points. So we can query the Lawson database. We can perform transactions on the Lawson forms. But it also has what I would say in generic third-party integration tools. That would be things like SQL, web services, anything like that where we can use SQL to query a third-party database, maybe our Kronos database, maybe something else downstream. And it's not platform-dependent either. It has integration for Oracle, SQL Server, DB2, just about anything you could think of. We can also handle file processing, reading and writing of files, transferring of files, all of that. So it's a great tool for integration to be able to automate sending data downstream, receiving data from a system, and updating Lawson, all of those types of things. And then for reporting, really it's not, it's not an analytics tool. It's not meant to, like replace LBI or some of the Infor BI, new tools like that, where you have a dashboard and everything's displayed in real time. But what it can be great for is distributing documents to users that may be like reports. So one example of something I've done for a customer is a mapping for those of you who may run Windows and be annoyed with the fact that the NTIDs are showing in the system, and those are hard to distinguish, names of users or who it actually belongs to. We can use IPA to call a back-end system utility that spits out a mapping, put that information into a CSV or a spreadsheet-type document, and then distribute that document to a network share or some other location that can be accessed by users of the system. So it's more of a great distribution tool for data that may be pulled from the system in an automated fashion or some sort of scheduled fashion and distributed to users on some sort of network drive or things like that. And as far as some techniques, the user actions, that's going to be a big piece of the approval process. So it's important. There's a couple different things there. Approval is a broad term. With the user actions, we have a lot of different flexibility in terms of how approvals are handled. Not just what's displayed, so we can display via mobile, via email, or via the in-basket, right in Lawson like I had shown, but we can also change the content. So we can display custom content, custom HTML, whatever we need to display to the end user, we can make it look nice and make it relevant. That's the other important thing. We don't want them clicking a bunch of buttons. We want them to have a clear, concise screen that displays all the information they need to be able to make that decision and take action on our work item. We can also build some cool things into the user actions like approval thresholds. So maybe we have a group of participants who are approving something, and we can say that we need a uniform response from that particular group. So 100% yeses or 100% nos, or we want 50%, whatever that threshold might be. And then we can also implement escalations directly into the tool to say, after a certain amount of time, this user action or this approval has expired for the user, and we may automatically reject the transaction, or we could build something in to say, escalate it to their manager to tell them they haven't been on top of their work, and this is delinquent, and we need you to escalate the approval and work with the user to get it pushed through the system. So those are all some common uses of IPA, kind of broad categories of work or development techniques that can be used. And then we're going to jump into what I would call more of the advanced uses for IPA or some specific solutions that you may be able to take back to your organization and implement. So some processes, this is kind of an overview of the ones we're going to talk about, but these are common solutions customers have implemented. We can build out automated user provisioning. So a lot of that, there's server-side utilities and scripts that can be used to load users into the system, but that requires access to the server, which if you're cloud-based, you're not going to have that potentially, and also some manual work still to create the scripts and execute them and things like that. IPA can be used to automate all of that. So we can build the scripts, execute the scripts, schedule the process. Everything can be encompassed in IPA. We can also do auto monitoring and notifications of the loss in job queue. So maybe we have a bunch of users submitting batch jobs in the system, and our end users aren't very good about cleaning up after themselves or checking for jobs that may have failed. So we can automate the monitoring of that and through IPA, and then notify end users or maybe IT or system administrator of jobs that are in needs recovery and need to take action. So it's reducing that manual step of going in and looking and checking and reviewing that in the system. And then some different development techniques that maybe aren't a full solution in and of themselves, but can be applied to a variety of different processes, are encrypting and decrypting of files using PGP. There's a node now in IPA that's delivered to handle that. That can be very common for security purposes, obviously, and then it's a requirement I've seen sometimes for vendors, benefit vendor feeds potentially, where we need to be able to manage that. Sending text and SMS notifications, that's a new feature to IPA that we'll look at, in addition to the emails. That's always been an option, but this introduces the idea of sending a text message through the system. And then we'll also talk more about web services, which is a pretty broad category, but specifically the REST and SOAP type web services that can be called, that are common kind of industry standard technology that allows us integration and direct API connection to third parties, essentially. So 3 examples of vendors that I've worked with and built solutions for using IPA are Avalara, who has an AvaTax solution for sales tax for billing, Texas, which is a vendor that does warehouse management integrating with the loss and PO module. And then HireRight is just an example, but there's many of them out there. Background check and screening vendors for candidates. Obviously, we're hiring them into our system, entering the employees, but getting that background check, getting that drug screening or whatever that is, getting that data over to the vendor could be a manual process where you're going in and keying it into their system and hitting submit. We can use IPA to automate the transmission of that data and receiving responses back from the vendor, all within our system. So a little bit of a deeper dive on the advanced uses. The automated user provisioning. For each of these, we're going to kind of go through what makes up that solution and the important nodes or functions that you would be using in that process. So when we talk about automated user provisioning, we're talking about the security setup. Generally, when we do this in IPA, the easiest place to start is the provisioning of basic employee and manager level access. Everyone in your system, regardless of their role or function, is going to be an employee. So it's easy to identify at a minimum what that type of user is going to need. And the same is true of a manager. If they are a manager defined based on their position code, we're going to grant them access to manager self-service or that additional level of access. So types of things we would be looking at or to do in IPA would be creating that actor or that RM record, their RM identity, what security roles do they have assigned, maybe groups they belong to, things like that. We'll also want to assign their identities, which are what allow them to log into the system. So we might have an SSOP or an SSOP v2 identity. That's when you sign on. Those are your credentials. Then we'll also could have that environment identity, which allows you to submit the batch jobs. And then our employee identity, which assigns employee information, the company employee number, back to a user record for ESS and MSS. And then obviously we can also assign or unassign security roles to specific users. When defining a solution like this, there's a lot of different ways to do it. We can build it right into our event. So on that hire, as soon as that PA52 gets processed, we want to create a record or something like that. But what I like to do is schedule a back-end process to run daily, to sweep the database and query a specific record set based on a criteria like a hire date for this record is less than or equal to today, they don't have a term date, and they don't have a user account set up. Those three criteria would identify to me somebody that should have a RM record set up and roles assigned and all of that, and so they're going to go through our process. And that would be something that just runs every day and picks up new hires as they get processed into the system. A little consideration would be if you're running both LSF and Landmark, if you have IPA, you're going to need to set up the users in both systems, assuming the environments are federated. So that complicates it a little bit, or I guess it duplicates your efforts because you're putting everything in LSF and then mirroring those transactions in Landmark. A couple different ways to handle that, but just something to be cognizant of because users will need to be set up in both places if you're running both applications and they are federated environments. So some of the IPA nodes that we would leverage there are going to be a resource update node. That's the one on the furthest left side here. That resource update node is going to handle all of your LSF functionality. So going into the loss and security administrator, it's automating all those button clicks. Create the RM record, create the identities, assign the environment information, all of that type of stuff. The Landmark transaction is the one in the middle. That's going to do everything the resource update query node does except the Landmark version of it. So we're going to be creating the actor record, assigning the identities. When I talked about mirroring those transactions, very similar conceptually, all the stuff we'd be doing the Landmark side, just the verbiage is a little bit different. And then again, you're using a different node because it is a different system, so that's a different function. Again, all of these nodes serving specific purposes. The last one listed here is an optional. It should be kind of either these or this, but these two, the resource update and the Landmark transaction, are kind of one-off records or one at a time. I'm going to create this record, and then I'm going to go back and create the next one. The system command can be used. If you are familiar with, or a lot of organizations have leveraged already, something like the load users command, which is a server-side or a utility that can be run on the server to pick up a file, pre-formatted file, importing all of the user setup data. It's kind of an automated load or mass load. So those are definitely still options, and they can definitely be used in IPA. We would just instead be leveraging the system command to execute that utility within IPA, and then also leveraging IPA to build those input files for us on the system. For the auto monitoring of the job queue, again, this is a specific kind of generic case, but it could apply to really any table in your database. If you want to monitor for specific error code in a table or for records matching a company or anything like that, this type of solution could be used for any of those things. But the job queue is one we picked on because it can be kind of applied to everybody. So in this example, we'd be monitoring the system job queue for jobs that have gone into a waiting or needs recovery status. Those are the ones that are actionable. Those are ones that we need to not get rid of, but address. So what we would be doing here is alleviating the need for a user to go in every day or manually and pull up the job queue and look in waiting and all users to see if it's there. We're going to automate all of that in IPA. So it's a little bit of the nodes that will be leveraged here. We're going to go back to the system command. That's going to automate, again, basically someone logging into LID and typing in the JQ status utility with the -W or a waiting flag. IPA will execute that command and pull all of the output that would be pushed into the command line. Then that output is going to be queried and manipulated using the data iterator, which basically does exactly as it says. It iterates through data, but we're going to be forcing the system command output into it and reading each line, telling it how to parse the file, essentially, and manipulating that data as needed, to which then it will be added to an email. And we can either notify the specific end user and say, hey, go look at your job, or we could notify a distribution group you may have set up in Outlook or listserv or something like that. If you have a help desk or a IT support or whoever that group might be or that individual might be, in your organization, we can automatically email them of all the findings that the IPA flow has come upon. One other thing just to note that I like to highlight, you'll notice some of the nodes have circles, or they are kind of circles or rectangles, and some of the nodes are just standalone. Anything that's a rectangle kind of symbolizes that iterative nature. So a query, back to the very first slide, that was a iterative node, and that's just showing you that it will be looping through a data set. Whereas a system command, or an email, that's serving one specific function. In a query or data iterator, we're going to be processing rows of data, and that kind of illustrates that fact, the full circle. And if you follow the arrows, one record at a time, processing, 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 and then all of our emailing or notifications or edit checks or logic, whatever we'll be putting inside of the loop would then exist in between these two nodes to be processed for each record that's found, kind of like a for or a while loop in programming. PGP encryption and decryption. This is one that maybe could have been possible with older versions of PFI. It's certainly possible via command line or other, batch or shell script or something like that you may have available. But this is great because it's tied directly into IPA. We now have a specific node for it. And it can be, if you're in the cloud and you don't have access to some of that types of stuff, all of this can then be managed in a cloud-friendly and supported extension or tool within the application. So there's not a whole lot to it as far as the flow development is concerned. They make it pretty easy here. We have one node to decrypt files and another node to encrypt files. And then we have, obviously, the file access node, which is used for reading and writing files. So we may query a bunch of data, transform it, write it to a file on the system using a file access node, and then maybe we encrypt it with the encryption node to send it off to our vendor or to some other downstream system. A couple things to know here is that all of the encryption keys are handled or managed within Landmark. There's a utility called SecADM, SECADM, which allows you not only to generate your own public-private key pair for your server, but also import public keys for other systems or providers to be able to encrypt and message files between those systems. So all of that's handled on the Landmark server, and then we call those keys within these nodes to do the function. So there's very little programming involved. All of it's managed directly through the encryption and decryption nodes in the flow. Sending of the text and SMS notifications. Not everybody's going to want to be sending SMS or text to their employees, but depending on your organization, it might be a great need. Specifically, if you have a bunch of employees who don't have even email accounts. Maybe you have a bunch of drivers out, or a fleet of drivers, or volunteers, or whatever, people out in the field that maybe don't have an email, certainly aren't going to be at their computer, but you need to manage communications with those particular employees. So now in Landmark 11, we actually have a specific node for this, the SMS node. But even if you're not yet on Landmark 11, we can leverage what's called the web run node to achieve the same kind of functionality. Very simple here. What we would be doing is querying that data out of our system using that iterative loss and query node. Most likely, obviously, the employee name. We would need their mobile number stored somewhere in the system, and then we can dynamically construct a message to them and send it out all within IPA. This does require a subscription to a third-party service, so Infor doesn't have an engine to actually send the message. What it does is integrate with a third-party service. The one I don't know, there may be other ones, but the one they reference in their guides and things like that is called Twilio, which you can set up an account with, and it will handle all the communication. So we would send Twilio requests to distribute a message, and it handles all of the actual texting. So it's kind of a third-party subscription, but a cool functionality that we can now build right into our process flows, and it's kind of an alternative to email where maybe it doesn't make sense for email or whatever, given a subset of employees or whatever your type of business your organization is in. The last of which, and one we'll kind of do a little hands-on demo with, are the web services. So what is a web service? Basically, they're used for machine-to-machine communication between another system or vendor system. These particular calls are helpful because they allow us to process real-time responses back from a vendor, from some other system, and integrate them right into our solution. So examples of web services, technically, that you may be familiar with are like the Lawson DME and AGS calls. So the Lawson DME call is essentially a web service, Lawson style of web service, which, given a request and specific parameters, be it a product line, database table, and a set of fields, we return back information matching that to the user. That's how the Microsoft add-in works and things like that. Design Studio, some of the customizations there. So that should be a familiar topic. The same is true of an AGS call, where that would be a transactional-based web service where we're passing parameters into a form, and that's automatically invoking that response, and we can add or transact into the system and receive back messages from the system. When we talk about third-party vendors, Twilio is a great example of one, who will have publicly available API guides that we use for our development. Those are typically going to be using REST or SOAP-based web service calls, which are kind of industry standards here. And so IPA allows for that integration or use of those web service calls using these specific nodes. So if we're dealing with a RESTful-based web service, we would be using a couple different nodes here. Typically in our RESTful-based web services, we're passing JSON input or parameter strings to a URL. We would be using the JSON node, which is a JavaScript object notation. It's kind of like XML in terms of you've never heard of it before. It's a way of constructing objects and a document together. And then we'd be leveraging the web run. This is the key node here, which allows us to execute that RESTful web service call against the system. We'll take a little bit of a look at an example using the web run node to actually execute some calls against Lawson in a second to show what that looks like. But that web run node is going to return a response. Typically, it's in the form of JSON notation. So we would be using that JSON parser to then get our information back out. In that example, we may be looking simply for a status. Well, was our call successful or did it have an error? Or we could be interrogating for information. In the case of a background check, given an employee ID or a candidate identifier, what's the status of their background check? Did they pass? Did they fail? Is it still in process? And we can pull that valid data back from the application via IPA and update that status in our own database automatically. And then for the SOAP-based web services, conceptually pretty much the exact same thing, just a little bit of a different technology. So the nodes we're using are going to be different. SOAP-based web services are all XML. So that's why we'll be leveraging the XML node here to build and parse our XML documents to be sent and received from a downstream system. And then we'd be leveraging the web service node, which is a little confusing the way the names work, but the web service node is going to be used for our SOAP-based web services, and the web run node is going to be used for our RESTful-based web services. So that XML input will be put into our web service node, and we would execute the SOAP web service call against the system. So this is going to be all for that third-party integration. Typically, whenever I'm developing an IPA flow, we're working with that third-party vendor, and they would have some sort of publicly available API guide which tells you how to construct the calls, URLs. You may need, in the case of Twilio, to set up an account. There's some authentication. There's test servers you should call, production servers, and whatever. All of that, you're going to be working with your third-party vendor to help develop, and then leveraging their API guide to understand, how they have built these web services out. Another kind of general example for this that we've built into IPA, address validation. So United States Postal Service has a free validation tool. I believe it's a RESTful-based web service call. So if you go out and set up an account for them, they have their own API guide. It's another example where you can create an account, and using that web run node, we can pass in addresses from our Lawson database, send them to the United States Postal Service account, and they'll send us back either, that's not a valid address, or the fully qualified address with the addresses on the right line and the right abbreviations and all that stuff, which then in turn we can update back in our system using one of the Lawson API nodes. So just to do a quick demo, I think it's always easier to get your hands on the stuff and look at it along with talking to it, or open up a process flow that uses a web run node. So a very common use of the web run that a lot of people have implemented, but they may not truly know that it's what they're really doing is executing that RESTful-based web service call is submitting a job within Lawson. And so how would we do that? A couple different things here. We would be having the web run node to execute the call. And all that's really simulating is calling of a web program. So when I have it set up to execute against Infor Lawson, I have a connection string here set up under main. So if I go back, all of that's going to be handled within my process server administrator. Under our system configuration, we have a setting here for the web. And so when I tell it main, what it's doing is it's executing a call against this web root with these credentials, and then calling a specific program, CGI Lawson job run.exe. So it's automating essentially a call that would go here and call this program. But that alone is going to require some parameters to be passed to it. So that's what we're adding in here. Our function, we're going to be running a job, and the job name, which I've hard-coded but could be dynamically passed as well, as a variable. That's more common. But for demo purposes, we've just hard-coded it here. I'm going to automatically submit the HR 211 job under this user account. And then the other cool parameter we can add here is a wait equal true. And so what this is going to do is tell the system or the process flow it can't continue running until it's received a successful response back from the system that the job has finished. And that can be helpful if we're doing batch processing where there's dependencies, especially in payroll, some of the AP processing. We don't want to just go and run all the jobs at the same time. We need to wait. There's a logical order in these dependencies in terms of what they had finished. And then when it sends a response back to us, that's when we're looking at our success string here. So the success string is basically telling us it's looking for a message or a response back from the system that has, sorry, I just need to reconnect, indicated the job is completed successfully. This is a Lawson code 63. It really doesn't mean a lot to me or to anybody, but if you were to look at the back-end code, again, this is machine-to-machine communication, so there's really not meant to be interpreted by humans, but the 63 is telling us the status of the job is successful submission. So let's see if we can log in. Looks like I'm having some connection issues. There we go. So just quickly, we'll log in here and take a look at what this actually does. So I'll go back into my Lawson system here. And the big theme is just automating button clicks here. It's not hard for somebody to come in and submit a job. That's a very common task within the system. But if it's something we're doing every day or something we're doing really early in the morning or late at night, it's just a monotonous task that's kind of a waste of resource time, that's a great thing to automate with IPA. That's really where you start to see and gain the efficiencies using the tool. So what we're going to automate is the submission or the button clicking here of running that job within the IPA tool. And the expectation then is that I would have something in my print manager and within my job scheduler that it would look like somebody had run it manually. So I can run this on the server, through the Process Server Administrator tool, or as a developer, I can actually run it right on my desktop. And we have some play and stop and pause buttons, kind of looks like a music player or something like that you might have through iTunes. Same thing here. Again, we're moving this process from start to finish like a workflow. So if I hit the play button here, I can tell it to run locally or on the server, whatever, locally just being on my own PC with my own the resources on my computer. And you can see it's spitting out a log here, which tells us a little bit about what the process is doing. Not a whole lot of reason to ever look in the log day to day, but very helpful for troubleshooting to understand what the process is doing. Every node that it hits, we'll put something into the log to tell you. So let's take a look at what that log is going to look like. And this is going to be a log, when we talked about work units and the Process Server Administrator, every time a process flow runs, that's where you'd be going to look at these logs to validate what's been done or check if something hasn't been done if you're doing troubleshooting. So we can see it's hit the start node, and it completed the start node, which is initializing variables. And then we're running our next node, which is going to be run HR211, which corresponds to this node. And you can see the call that it's making against the URL, if you remember from our connection parameter that was set up. And it's using this web program, and it's posting a string to it through this web service call. These are all the parameters that I had built out in the node. And then it's receiving a response back from the system telling us a little bit about what happened. So who submitted the job, that's that NTID of my account, which job was submitted, blah, 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 and then our status. That's where that 63 comes into play. So this is a successful status. It found that string that it parsed back, and we're all good. And so if we go look at our print manager or our job scheduler, we can see this new job ran just now. And if we go into our print manager, we can actually validate that output and look at it. So all of that's automated through IPA using the web run node. This could be true of any web-based service or web service you're calling in IPA. If we wanted to expand on this even further, we could get fancier with adding email notifications. We can actually pick up and distribute the print file. So if we wanted to attach the print file to an email and send it to an employee, we can do that as well. This is really just one technique that could be applied into many or different types of processes. So with that, I'll pass it back to Steve. We'd like to open up for some questions. Do you have any?
Actually, what we're going to do in lieu of time is go through and make sure we get back to everybody with their questions. So we will make sure if you have asked a question that we will reply via email and be in touch shortly with that answer. So at this time, this does conclude our presentation. Again, thank you everybody for joining us today, and we certainly welcome any future conversations. Again, have a great day. Thank you very much.